This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host G. Sampath. In a major embarrassment for India's human rights image, the National Human Rights Commission has been denied A status accreditation for a second year in a row. The Geneva-based United Nations-linked Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions took the decision to defer it again during a meeting of the Subcommittee on Accreditation or SCA earlier this month. The NHRC was set up under the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993 and it had enjoyed A status accreditation since the beginning of the process in 1999, which it retained in 2006, 2011 and in 2000 also after a deferment. So what are the reasons now for the deferment of accreditation for India's top human rights institution? What are the implications of not possessing this A status? And what does India have to do to get the accreditation back? We discuss all these questions in great detail in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Henry Tiffine, Executive Director, People's Watch, a non-profit that works in the field of human rights. Henry, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to In Focus.
You're welcome, Mr. Sampath.
So Henry, I just wanted to ask you to start off with, there are several national and state level human rights institutions in India. Before we get to the specifics of the NHRC accreditation issue, can you give us a quick overview of where the NHRC sits in amidst all these institutions, its importance, its role in the context of the human rights landscape in India?
Well, thank you for this first question. I mean, this is a very unique institution in India, and we stand apart globally in the Committee of Nations in the establishment of national and state human rights institutions. At the national level, we have the National Human Rights Commission, but it was a third institution to come into play. Earlier to that, you had the National Commission for Women established, the National Commission for Minorities established, and thereafter you have the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, you have the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, the Central Information Commissioner, the Central Commissioner for Persons with Disabilities, and the National Commission for Safai Karmacharis. Therefore, 9 national human rights commissions in India is a model to the globe. And that is what I think first I would like to place. On paper, we have very strong institutions that have been established, and those who had mandated these institutions had taken a lot of trouble to ensure that these institutions were in place. Secondly, you have a spate of over 160 state human rights institutions in the states, different states and union territories of the country. Some arise out of the Protection of Human Rights Act and therefore are the state human rights institutions. Some arise out of the National Commission for Protection of Children Act, and therefore you have state commissions in different states. The same with women's commissions, minority commissions, commissions especially for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and the state information commissions in the various states. So this is a unique establishment of institutions that we have in this country, and therefore it is important that as citizens, we make them effective and we utilize their services and ensure that and monitor and ensure that they are made effective in our country.
Right. Thank you so much for this really comprehensive overview of the human rights institutional landscape in India, Henry. That really appreciate that contextualization. Now, in this context, what is the function and value of this A status accreditation for a national human rights body? I mean, we have been denied it for the second year in a row, and I was just wondering, are there other grades as well as A status? Is there B status, C status also? So what's this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, these status gradation is a process that has been developed not by the United Nations, but by a body which is where all the national human rights institutions globally come together, known as the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. It used to be earlier known as the ICC, There are too many complications in ICC, so they changed their name. They came under a legal body. It is their body.
So basically, this is a peer-reviewed gradation.
Yeah, right. It's a peer-reviewed accreditation. And this accreditation process is governed by their own rules. It is their establishment. And the United Nations uses this accreditation process for permitting members of national human rights institutions access to the United Nations. So unless you are an A-grade institution, you cannot have access to the United Nations. So this is important. Now, if I need to go to the United Nations, I need to be part of a delegation of organizations that have ECOSOC status. That is what the UN process allows in terms of accreditations of individuals. But in terms of national human rights institutions, it is the GANHRI which gives this A status or B status. There are two status only at the moment. And an A status institution has access to all participation in all UN processes, whether they are Geneva-based or whether they are New York-based or any other place. So that is the speciality. And A grade is based on what in 1993 was a General Assembly resolution of general standards, guidelines for institutions across the globe to follow, which came to be known as the Paris Principles. This was evolved in Vienna in 1992. And thereafter, the General Assembly passed it in 1993. So A-grade institutions in clear terms are institutions which are Paris Principles compliant. So that is what is the meaning. So an A-grade institutions can proudly say that we are a Paris Principles compliant institution. And that is the significance in terms of having an A-grade. The second grade is a non-A grade. Let me say it that way. That's much better, which is called the B grade. And this is where people popularly say you are A-grade institutions or you have been downgraded. I don't like to use the word downgraded. We always like to say we want an upgraded institution, a national human rights institution, because an upgraded institution, which is an A-grade institution, comes closer to the aspirations of the people in terms of their protection and promotion of human rights.
Right. So, now you pointed out three very important aspects of this accreditation. One, of course, is access to UN, to the United Nations. Secondly, you will be known as Paris Principles compliant, and so on. So, coming to the actual issue here, GANHRI deferring the accreditation for India for a second year in a row. So, what is the process by which this decision was arrived at? And why was India not given this accreditation? And thirdly, can India appeal it? Is there any forum where we can say, no, this was unfair to us, so please give it to us, and so on?
Well, there is a process which is governed by this is the process which is governed by GANHRI's own statute. So I'm taking it from their own statute. We have an A-grade status granted to us in the year 2017. In 2023, when we went for accreditation, we were deferred by 1 year. So October 2023, the process took place, and in March.
So the status, once the status is given, it is valid for 5 years or for how many years?
5 years. It is 5 years. It is
okay.
5 years. In 2016, when they went, they were deferred by 1 year, which means while they were being deferred, the subcommittee on accreditation, which gives the recommendations, and the subcommittee on recommendations is a body of 4 members of the GANHRI from representing the 4 regions where you have the regional bodies of national human rights institutions, namely the Asia Pacific region, the African region, the European region, and the Latin American region. So this is the Americas, as they're called. So these are the 4 regions. Each of these regions regionally select their representative to the subcommittee on accreditation. This term, the subcommittee on accreditation was New Zealand was the convener, Honduras was a member, South Africa was a member, and Greece was a member, representing the 4 regional mechanisms. So the subcommittee on accreditation makes the recommendations, and the elected bureau of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions agrees to follow the recommendations that are provided. Now, in the review process, either you are Paris Principles compliant and therefore you are granted an A-grade accreditation, which means you become Paris Principles compliant. But even if you are Paris Principles compliant, there are certain recommendations which are given to enhance your standards. So Paris Principles, having been established in 1993, could not be rewritten, and therefore the GANHRI developed what they called the general observations to the Paris Principles. So the general observations that are followed in GANHRI are divided into two parts. The first part, known as essential observations, which are essentially to be followed by all. And the other is known as practices that promote Paris Principles more, which is not considered to be very essential, but it is also important. So even if an A grade is granted to an institution, the subcommittee on accreditation always gives recommendations. Here in our case, we were given a deferral last year in March 2023 and told to come back, ensuring that those recommendations are adhered to. Now, it's interesting to note that what was mentioned in March 2023 were almost, let me be very clear, almost a repetition of what was made in 2017, what was made in 2016, and as old as what was made in 2011. So, which means what recommendations were made by the subcommittee on accreditation in 2011 got repeated in 2016, got repeated in 2017, and got repeated in March 2023. And March 2023 recommendations had not been adhered to in the period, and therefore it had forced the subcommittee on accreditation to say, since you have not adhered to the recommendations that we had proposed in 2023, and in the past, perhaps because the subcommittee's recommendations are not over, it is because of that reason you are kept under deferral, which means you will definitely they will continue to say we are an A grade status institution because we were granted our A grade and we have not been so-called B grade, made B grade now, which in popular terms is known as downgrading. Instead, we have found that there are insufficiencies in terms of your adherence. You have not reached to the standards that were recommended to you in terms of statutes, perhaps in terms of structure, and therefore another period of 1 year is given for yourself to improve and reach those standards. So that is what is the significance of this deferral. And for a country like India, which is, as I said in the beginning, proudly the only country which has so many national and state human rights institutions, I find it is not good for the democracy that India projects itself globally to have these institutions deferred. National Human Rights Commission of India deferred for a second period. And the significance in India for us is more important than what it is globally. If the National Human Rights Institution is not a model for the country to follow, then the state human rights institutions and other national human rights institutions in our country will also lose their standards in terms of their practical functioning. And that is important. And I forgot to tell you something which is unique in our country. Our National Human Rights Commission under the Protection of Human Rights Act does not only comprise 6 members, and we will come to the members later, but also you have a category of deemed members, which no other country globally has. And that way I say we are unique. Unfortunately, this unique statutory creation that has been made historically, which comprises the chairpersons of the Women Commission, the chairpersons of the Minority Commission, the chairpersons of the SC Commission, the chairpersons of the ST Commission, the chairpersons of the Child Rights Commission, and now the chairperson of the Backward Class Commission. They are all ex officio deemed members of the NHRC. So our NHRC has 6 full-time members plus deemed members, which are another 7, making the whole NHRC 13 members. This is unique. Statutorily, it is unique. How far is it practically put into practice is a big question mark. The deemed members, which is the full commission, rarely meets twice a year, rarely actually meets once a year for the past few years. So these are all considerations which in the past have been taken up very seriously by the subcommittee on accreditation in its recommendation. So the deferral now is to ensure that the recommendations are put into practice as actually made effect in this country.
Right. Thank you for that, Henry. Now, you made a reference to the Paris principles earlier and how one has to be compliant with them in order to be eligible for this continuous A status accreditation. Now, can you talk a little bit very quickly about what are these Paris principles and which of them India is in sync with, and which are the Paris principles India is violating or has fallen foul of? India is in the National Human Rights Commission.
Paris principles are guidelines internationally created, which emerged from the Second World Conference in Vienna and then went through the process and became a UN General Assembly resolution. And this is to ensure that the Commission in different parts of the globe, which are created either constitutionally or through special statutes, as in the case of India. Some places may be taking different forms. In India and large parts of Asia, it is the form of a commission. In large parts of Latin America, it forms a model called the Ombudsman model. And in large parts of Europe, it takes the form of institutes, like in Germany, like you have in Denmark, etc. So all these models, we should have a common principle, and those are known as the common principles for national human rights institutions, known as the Paris Principles of 1993. Now, that talks about three major things. One, this national human rights institution has to reflect pluralism. This national human rights institution has to be independent, and which means independent functioning, independent of the government. And third, this has to be an effective mechanism. So these are the three cores of the Paris Principles: pluralism, independence, and effectiveness. Now, the Paris Principle emphasizes on the mandate of the National Human Rights Institution of every country, that it has a full, wholesome mandate to protect all human rights of all peoples, that it has broad functions, so that its functions are not limited. Therefore, you have broad functions. You are independent from the government. You represent pluralism of our respective countries wherever they are established. They have adequate powers and they have resources to keep them actually independent. They cooperate with all bodies in the country, which includes cooperation with the civil society, and they have also to ensure that they work as closely as possible with the international human rights system that is in place, which means with the Human Rights Council, with the treaty bodies, with the special procedures, with the universal periodic review, etc., etc. So these are the core of the Paris Principles. And these Paris Principles are what compliance with makes them A grade, or non-A grade, which is B grade.
Right. Now, so I sort of infer from this that India has fallen foul of many, if not most of these principles. Okay. Now, what are the implications of not having this A status? You spoke earlier about not having access to the United Nations because of not having this status. So, will this affect India's ability to vote at the Human Rights Council or at any other international forums? Can you just take us through what are the implications of not having?
I want to make that clear because I want to make this clear. Thank you for this question. There is a little bit of debate that is going on in the media in the country. This needs to be clarified. Number one, when you lose your A grade status, which means when you get B grade, you're assigned B grade in your re-accreditation process, then it is then that you have a right to appeal. When you lose your A grade status, you have a right to appeal to GANHRI. In this case, India has not lost its A grade. It has been deferred by another 1 year. I mean, that is exactly what is being spoken of.
So, is there any limit to the number of deferments, or we can go on deferring for 10, 20 years? Like, what is the process?
I mean, let's be very plain. For a country like India, as powerful as India is, politically in the global hemisphere, a deferral is a very serious implication. In that sense, moral implication, not getting into the legal implication. It is a moral slap on the face of our National Human Rights Commission for refusing, let me be polite and say refusing to adhere to the recommendations that were made, and I will come to the recommendations later. So that is the serious implication. Now, a deferral definitely means that you have to take definite steps. When last year, when they were deferred by a year, I wrote on behalf of the All India network of individuals and NGOs working with national and state human rights institutions to the NHRC saying, we want to accompany you. We from civil society are proud of our institutions and want to ensure that we have better institutions. That's why I always call, we want upgraded institutions. We don't want a downgraded NHRC. And for me, a downgraded NHRC means a downgraded protection and promotion of human rights in this country, not only by the NHRC, but by the host of other institutions. That is why we are interested in ensuring that we get a grade A grade. Deferral does not deny them any access anywhere at the moment. So that is one. And two, deferral does not give them a possibility of going on appeal against this deferral. Deferral only means that you have not passed the examination and therefore prepare yourself for improving in every recommendation that has been given. And therefore, we need to get into what were the recommendations given in October 2023. The first recommendation that was given was to ensure that your vacancies are filled. It related to composition and pluralism. In 2023, when the recommendation was given, there were 3 vacancies out of 6 members. It's shameful that 2 of those vacancies were vacancies of 976 days, vacancy of a Chief Justice, former Chief Justice of a High Court to be appointed. Justice Murugesan, who is from Tamil Nadu, who was the Chief Justice of the Delhi High Court and was in the National Human Rights Commission, was the last to hold this slot of former Chief Justice, which is 976 days then. Now it is crossed. That vacancy was that long. And the second vacancy that existed was about 450 days of a former judge of the Supreme Court of India being appointed. Is it not shameful on our part of our country? And this is not about the NHRC. This is about the government. And it's important. This indicates that the government of this country does not care about the protection of human rights because they did not care to ensure that these 2 vacancies were filled up. The third vacancy happened to be that of a woman member, which was hurriedly filled up in December 2023 after the civil society report went and said there are 3 vacancies. It is shameful to point out that 2 of the 3 members who are now on the commission, which is the chairperson, Justice Arun Mishra, and which is Mr. Jain, both of them will retire on the 2nd of June 2024, leaving the NHRC with 1 sole woman member alone, which will be historically the only woman member who would be acting as the chairperson, which has never happened in Indian history. Is that not shameful for India? That was what was pointed out. They said, ensure your composition and pluralism. Number 2, ensure that your selection process is much more inclusive. Announce your vacancies. Make sure that you advertise your vacancies. Make sure that there are selection criteria fixed. Make sure that civil society also participates in the process of selecting members to the National Human Rights Commission. This has been refused. This was the second recommendation. The third, of course, was police officers in the investigation of complaints. Now, we have to differentiate in terms of investigation. Investigation of human rights is different from criminal investigation. Policemen are competent in criminal investigation, that is crime investigation. They are trained in crime investigation. And I have no problem in them doing crime investigation. But goodness sake, human rights investigation requires qualities which are a little in addition to only crime investigation, because you have to be competent in terms of human rights and upholding human rights. And that is not done only by policemen. And that is why if you had an investigation team comprising only policemen, that would not suffice. That was pointed out to us. And this is being followed in other countries. This has been repeatedly told by civil society. But unfortunately, we refuse to take that and believe that policemen alone...
So, Henry, so what kind of people should be recruited by the NHRC for doing investigating of human rights crimes and so on? If not police, then who?
We are not saying it should not be police. We are saying it should be a team of people which can include very eminent police investigators. And I'm perfectly in game with that. You can also have advocates. You can have very experienced civil society members. you can have forensic experts, you can have lawyers, you can have a whole gamut of people all geared towards human rights investigation, investigation of human rights violations, rather than looking at it from the prism of only crime investigation. And that is exactly what has been pointed out in these recommendations of last year. The fourth is the appointment of the Chief Executive Officer of the Commission, as it is known now, which is the Secretary General. Now, for goodness sake, do not continue your Section 11, which permits that a secretary rank officer is appointed as the Secretary General of the NHRC. That is exactly what has been told from 2011 onwards.
This is Section 11 of the Human Rights Act?
Protection of Human Rights Act.
Okay.
Whereby that needs an amendment to the Act, whereby only a secretary of the government can be appointed as the Secretary General, and only an officer of the rank of DGP can be appointed as the Director General of Investigation. Now, you're making everybody state functionaries. These are all seconded from the government. And as long as they are seconded from the government, unfortunately, their lack of independence is visible greatly. Now, I don't want to belittle all officers who held the position of Secretary General to be people who did not possess an independent posturing. But there were people who had no experience in governance of a human rights institution. And therefore, there are so many people involved in governance of institution. There are people who manage 500 staff, people who manage 1,000 staff, who have a very effective chief executive officer. All chief executive officers need not be only from the IAS. It can be from anywhere. And that is exactly what is being told to the NHRC. And if that was done, you would have, let me for people to understand, say, and I don't think the person whose name I'm going to mention is going to be very happy about it, but let me say, why can't an Aruna Roy be a chief education officer if her age permitted it? I'm giving an example. She has been in administration earlier. She is a civil society representative at the moment. She has been in governance. She knows how to govern. She has contributed to the development of human rights in this country. What does she lack to be a Secretary General of the NHRC? This is what the fourth recommendation has been. We have not even bothered to even take it up to the Parliament for a debate. The fifth is cooperation with all bodies related to human rights. Please take civil society as your partners in protecting human rights. I remember Justice Verma, after retirement, telling me, whatever I achieved because of my cooperation with human rights institutions. That doesn't mean human rights activists and civil society representatives. And he said, my eyes opened when I became the chair of the NHRC. Opened not because of the statute, but because of my association with the most smallest civil society functionary who was working with perhaps Adivasis, who were working with religious minorities, was working on issues of bonded labor, on migrants, etc. They developed the strength in me to be able to achieve what I achieved. That is the humility of a chairperson, which I would like to recall when he's not here. And the last was, and the most important recommendation was a mandate to the NHRC to address human rights issues. Why has the NHRC not, and it is mentioned, why did the NHRC not address the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act? Is it not something which affects human rights in this country? Why has it not debated on the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act amendments of 2010 and again in 2020? What has FCRA done to this country? Why has it not been taken up by the NHRC? Why has the NHRC not spoken in public when earlier it has spoken about TADA, when earlier it has spoken about POTA and taken positions? Why has it not discussed about the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which the Supreme Court is now talking about? These are specifically mentioned in the recommendations of March 2023, which have not been done. This has got nothing to do with elections. This is with the mentality of the Commission. And the Commission, for all its functions, be it Foundation Day or a Human Rights Day, has nobody in the country to invite except the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, the President of India, the Vice President, the speaker, these are their functionaries. So if you're so powerful, and I asked Justice Arun Mishra, if you were so powerful in this country that for all your functions you could bring the most important policy makers to your functions, why could you not fill up these vacancies? Why could you not speak about these human rights issues? Why did you not intervene in the Supreme Court, which power you have on all these issues which were pending in the Supreme Court? That is what has been pointed out to us in this deferment. So this deferment is a serious matter. It is because of the position that India enjoys that we got a deferment. And I'm happy we got a deferment. But actually, we should understand that this is not only a deferment. It is actually a slap on our face saying we are not Paris Principles compliant. But compared to all what other countries are, therefore we have been deferred for the second time. And it's a serious matter for our consideration of the government. And unfortunately, political parties don't pay attention to it. Parliamentarians never debate about NHRC and the Protection of Human Rights Act, or for that matter, any other. We don't have a parliamentary human rights standing committee. We don't have that. And therefore, this is an opportunity for the government to rehaul all this and to work with a definite agenda once the actual recommendations of this subcommittee on accreditation comes up.
Right. I appreciate this really very detailed overview of the recommendations which the subcommittee on accreditation has been giving to India, and which, as you have explained, India has not been following, causing this deferment. And also, I mean, I didn't know this. Thank you for pointing out that India still does not have a parliamentary standing committee on human rights, which is really amazing. I mean, it's in this day and age. Anyway, so we are running out of time, sir. So one last question before I let you go. In your view, India needs to get, NHRC needs to get this accreditation back for all the reasons you've outlined. In your view, what, let us say, are the 5 things that India could do, India needs to do to deserve, not just get, to deserve an A status accreditation?
Number one, as I've said it earlier, so I will just repeat it very short. The vacancies have to be filled up. Please, I'm sorry. This was what they said. Let us not have a position where somebody is retiring, completing his or her tenure, and the commission has vacancies. Learn to fill up vacancies in advance is what they said. So vacancies have to be filled up, and don't have this glorious deemed member status. Make them active, make them ensure that all the functions except complaints handling in the commission are done by the full commission, which is the full-time members and the deemed members. That is number one. And this is serious. This has to be done. Then you can put up your head in the galaxy of nations. Number one. Number two, as we said earlier, your investigation has to completely change, ensuring that it is not only policemen, it is people who are selected for human rights investigation, which may also include policemen, but not only policemen. Third, start addressing all human rights issues. Why is a letter of appreciation to the chairperson given a diary number and made into a complaint? If I write a letter to Justice Arun Mishra, that is given a diary number and made into a complaint. And this is shameful. What is this? Please start talking in public about human rights. It matters to talk in public about human rights because people get educated. One of your mandates is to create awareness. Your second mandate is to advise the government. And the third mandate is to do complaints handling. Therefore, on all human rights issues, start talking about all human rights issues of all people in this country. And don't maintain silence. You did nothing for Sai Baba. You did nothing for Sai Baba. You allowed Stan Swami to die in jail. You did nothing for those in the Bhime Korean cases. You did nothing for the NewsClick editor's case, which yesterday, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has to talk about the fact that the arrest and remand is wrong. So all human rights should become your mandate. Fourth, your complaints handling has to change. It has to be transparent. Please start the process of open hearings. Don't do this closed hearings business. Have the court hearing. There is a court hall in the NHRC. That process of having open hearings has stopped. Your complaints handling has become a post box where most of the complaints are disposed of in different ways. Very few are taken up. That is what the figures show. And the last is, for goodness sake, don't only trust your IAS and IPS for Secretary Generals and DGP. There are much more effective people who can bring credibility to our institution by appointing them to these positions. These are perhaps the 5 matters that I would say that we need to focus on, and don't do it alone. Take your partners. We are partners. We are not your opponents in this country. We are partners because we want to uphold, promote, and protect human rights in this country. And there are thousands of people like me in this country who aspire to work and strengthen this institution. Bring them. They may be critical, yes, but use those critical voices and be genuine in your approach and take civil society and all other competencies available along for protection and promotion of human rights in this country. And one more request because of your debate, let not the NHRC alone utilize all the training opportunities offered through the regional body, the Asia Pacific Forum, and the global body. Never in this country's 30 years of the NHRC's history, as a deemed member of the NHRC, namely the National Commission for Women, which I mentioned, all these deemed members, not one of them have ever gone for a single meeting outside the country. Is that not wrong? I think it's time for many other national human rights institutions in the country to also independently apply for status in GANHRI. And that would give more opportunities, more exposure, and therefore better protection in this country through the other institutions as well. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Henry. Really sound pieces of advice there. Fill your vacancies. Don't rely only on policemen for your investigations. Include HR specialists as well. Have more transparency in your complaints hearing. Address all human rights issues. Talk about them. Don't just make diary entries, and don't just rely on, open up, make it more plural in terms of the Secretary General and DGP hirings and so on. Thank you so much, Henry. Those are really sound words of advice for the National Human Rights Commission. And hopefully, I think they will be taken up. People will debate all these issues more, and we will get our A status accreditation back sometime very soon. Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Samad. Thank you. Thank you very much.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.